Hi. To conclude our survey of the regional human rights protection mechanisms, I would now like to address the African system, which is not the only one that I could be discussing here. In fact, there's also the Arab Charter on Human Rights, but is the third fully developed system in the sense that it does not only include or provide for a legally binding human rights instrument, but also for a variety of monitoring and individual and state complaints mechanisms, which, as we have seen over the past few sessions, is what really makes universal and regional human rights systems effective, at least in theory. So in this first of two videos, I'll be introducing the structure of the system, as well as some of its potential merits and promises. And in the second clip, I'll be discussing the two main institutions for human rights protection, namely the African Commission and the African Court on Humans and People's Rights, as well as some of the challenges most notably related to political will. To start, the African Charter on Humans and People's Rights, also sometimes referred to as Banjul Charter, was signed and adopted in 1981 and came into force in 1986. And it therefore predates all the other instruments or parts that are currently important for the African system, most notably the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which in fact gave rise to the African Union as we know it today only in 2000. The Charter creates the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which came about in 1986, and the additional protocol to the Charter creates also the African Court of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1998. I will get to both of those institutions in the second clip. Before we get to the specific rights that are being protected in the Charter, it is notable that 54 out of 55 member states of the African Union, and Morocco is the only exception here, have ratified the African Charter. And this is a very strong ratification record that really shows the promise of an African system, which could potentially have a very far reach, or at least a very broad jurisdiction over the various states on the African continent. Another real merit of the Charter is that it is a quite amazing instrument in the breadth of protection that it provides for various rights, including not only political and civil rights, but also social, economic and cultural rights, distinguishing it therefore, for example, from the European Convention on Human Rights, which only provides for the first category. And it also protects people's rights, which is even included in the title, and provides for individual duties in the instrument. The drafting and coming into force of such a comprehensive human rights instrument is a legal achievement in and of itself. But even in practical terms, it could potentially spell for a very effective human rights system if indeed the institutional power, institutional authority was behind it too, which is, as we had seen in the second video, one of the challenges of the system. But the promise definitely is there. An absolute characteristic of the African Charter is, of course, that it enshrines and protects various people's rights, as it already promises in the title, sometimes also referred to as solidarity rights. And that includes in Article 19 the equality of peoples, in Article 20 the right to existence and self-determination, in Article 21 the disposition of their own wealth and resources, in Article 22 the right to social, economic and cultural development, and in Article 23 the right to peace and security. As you can already see, this is much more comprehensive and much more detailed than any other human rights instrument that exists globally. Remember, for example, that the two covenants do recognize the right to self-determination, but it's really one article that, while often construed broadly, leaves open the question of what precisely is included there. Here we clearly find some answers. The other interesting and potentially positive aspect of the Charter is that it discusses and recognizes duties, not only of the state, but also individual duties, for example, towards their family and their parents. It is noteworthy here that this is actually a longer standing debate in human rights. Very famously, when Mahatma Gandhi was asked to comment on the idea of a universal declaration on human rights, he said that in his experience, and as he had learned, as he said, from his illiterate mother, all rights accrue from duties well done. And obviously the question of duties has always been somewhat secondary to the discussion of rights. The African Charter remedies this, at least potentially. However, as is very well pointed out in the textbook, it also includes a sort of general limitation clause that is disguised or formulated as an individual duty towards the state. And that obviously is very dangerous to the very idea of individual rights, because such a limitation, general limitation clause, if very broadly understood and interpreted, could effectively undermine the African Charter and the various provisions that are supposed to protect the rights of individuals. We'll get back to the specific point once more when we talk about the challenges that the African system faces. And the final advantage to be mentioned is that the African Charter provides broad legal standing, not only for individuals and states, but also for NGOs. And not only can these apply to the African Commission, but under certain circumstances, they can also directly address the African Court of Human and People's Rights. While one can arguably say that these characteristics combined make the African system the most friendly one in terms of legal standing when compared to both the European and the Inter-American system, it is also true, however, that the number of cases launched there or filed to the African Commission and Court are in fact relatively low. And this is something to do with an awareness of the rights that are protected, as well as the institutions that protect them, and frankly also with the capacities that these institutions have. And this of course brings us to the topic of limitations or shortcomings of this regional system, and I will therefore refer you to the next clip in which I will elaborate on those.